him and his motives. But what we know so far is that he was discharged from the Army prematurely due to mental health reasons. But it's unclear if that discharge or any other factors would have legally disqualified him from purchasing a firearm. Obviously, a dishonorable discharge, a felony, a conviction, those sorts of things would result in your being prohibited under existing law from purchasing a firearm. But we don't know whether there are other circumstances beyond his premature discharge from the Army after only 3 months due to mental health reasons rises to the level necessary to invoke one of those disqualifying actions. So at this moment, there's still a lot we don't know. And of course, at times like this, we are all trying to make sense of this unspeakable tragedy. Obviously, I'm eager to learn more about the circumstances that led to this attack. But one thing's for sure, and that is local law enforcement officials leading this investigation and searching for answers have already done heroic work. Thanks to a Allen Police Department officer who was at the mall, who was able to, for other reasons, who was able to respond quickly and neutralize the shooter. But for that police officer, many others would have been injured and die. So I am grateful to the police officers, the emergency medical technicians, and healthcare workers who responded to this tragedy. As I said, especially the heroic officer who responded to the gunfire and immediately ran toward the danger. The shooter was carrying multiple weapons and had 5 additional guns in his car. If not for the quick action of that police officer, there's no question that even more families would be grieving today. I've spoken to local officials who are responding to this crisis, including Mayor Ken Folk and Police Chief Brian Harvey. I offered my condolences and offered whatever help we might be able to provide, whatever assistance we can provide. One of the things Chief Harvey told me that he particularly appreciated is the FBI had come forward with crime victim services, a number of FBI agents providing that assistance to the victims of this terrible shooting, which relieves a lot of the pressure on this local police department. And of course, the FBI is now taking the lead in the investigation, supported by Texas Rangers, the Department of Public Safety, and of course, the Allen Police Department. So today, I join all Texans in grieving for this senseless tragedy. We mourn the 8 lives that were stolen and lift up the survivors who will never forget the horror they endured that day. I know, Mr. President, because I have been part of negotiations over the last few years involving the so-called Fix NICS legislation. Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut and I took the lead on that bill to try to fix gaps in the background check system. The one area of consensus between people who are avid supporters of the Second Amendment and those who believe that we ought to ban some types of weapons, even for law-abiding citizens, the one area we can agree on is that people with criminal records and people who are mentally ill should not be able to purchase firearms. And that's simply enforcing current law. So we were able to do something in the Fix NICS bill a couple of years back, I think it was 2018 now, that I believe met my test for whether we should do legislation like that, and that is, will it save lives? And I believe it has. More recently, we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which is so new that it's only now being implemented. This bill did, of course, a number of things. It provided for an enhanced background check for gun purchasers between the age of 18 and 21. The reason why that age group is so important is because the profile of many of these disaffected young men who are obviously suffering from severe mental illness, who are so tortured that they not only want to commit suicide, they want to take other people with them. That cohort, that group of young purchasers, I believe we needed to go back and look at some of the juvenile records for mental health adjudications, for criminal convictions. These are the sorts of things that if you'd been an adult would disqualify you, and you would not be able to purchase a firearm under existing law. But in Uvalde, Texas, Salvador Ramos turned 18 years old, and even though everybody in the neighborhood knew he was a ticking time bomb, he had tortured animals, he had posted threats on social media, he shot his own grandmother, who insisted he go back to school after a long absence due to COVID restrictions. He was able to purchase firearms without revealing anything about his juvenile record, without consulting with the local police who knew him well. That's all changed by the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and the most recent tally I saw from the FBI is approximately 100 different purchases had been intercepted for individuals between the age of 18 and 21 who had disqualifying juvenile records that are now being queried as a result of that bill. But the other parts of it that are so important is we made the single largest investment in mental and community-based mental health care in American history in that bill. We were able to find an offset so it didn't involve spending new money, but it was literally billions of dollars in investment so more communities can have locally based community health services, because frankly there's too many people falling through that net. The net doesn't really even exist. And we also made sure that our schools provided more comprehensive services. Part of the problem, though, is as there's more demand for mental health counseling and treatment, is there not enough people qualified to provide those sorts of services. So this is a huge problem. The bill provided grants and incentives to educational institutions so more people would train in those areas. So there'd be more resources available for people suffering from psychological stress or even mental illness, so that they can hopefully get better and become productive members of society. So I know at times like this, people say, well, we need to do something. Twice in recent history, the United States Congress has come together on a bipartisan basis to do something that meets that test I mentioned a moment ago. Will it save lives? And I believe in both instances, the legislation we passed that was signed by the president will save lives. But of course, then we see what happened in Allen, and we wonder what else is there. I mentioned the fact that these mass shooters, not only are they taking the lives of innocent people, they are essentially committing suicide themselves. They know they're not going to make it out of here alive. And there's this phenomenon that I learned from law enforcement called suicide by cop, where actually mentally ill individuals who are unwilling to take their own life will encounter the police in a violent encounter which results in their loss of life, which essentially is a way of their committing suicide. I believe these mass shootings are also a form of suicide, because these shooters know they're not going to make their way out of it. But tragically, not only do they take their own life, they take the life of innocent others. So we grieve with all of the families and the entire community in and around Allen, Texas, as we do each time one of these incidents occurs. And we'll continue to look for ways we can find solutions to this sort of violence, but eventually, or ultimately, I believe what we're talking about are crimes, that while we can investigate crimes, we can prosecute crimes, we can punish crime, we can even deter crime. But we haven't yet figured a way to stop crime. But hopefully, there's more we can do. Mr. President, on another matter, the President of the United States convened his first meeting of the 4 top congressional leaders to discuss the looming debt crisis. A potential default has been on the horizon for months now. And from the beginning, both sides, Republicans and Democrats, have said, we believe the debt ceiling needs to be addressed. Republicans, for their parts, have said we need to do what we've done before, and that is to couple a debt ceiling increase with spending reforms, because you just can't keep maxing out your credit card and go back and ask that the credit card limits be increased without coming up with some plan to actually pay down the debt you incur. That's happened time and time again. I believe President Biden, when he was in the Senate, voted for that sort of coupling of spending reforms and debt ceiling increase. I think it was 4 times, if memory serves me correctly. But never before has the national debt been the size it is now. Of course, you can point to COVID-19. This was, to my mind, sort of equivalent of a domestic World War III, although it was a health care battle and war. And we had to do whatever we could to deal with it, and we did. But that spending continued when President Biden was in office with the Democratic House and a Senate, and without any additional votes from Republicans. After we'd done that together, as we should, do things in a bipartisan way if we can, Democrats, including the president, added another $2.7 trillion to the national debt. And now the president takes the incredibly irresponsible position that I'm not going to negotiate. We just want to raise the debt ceiling. We don't want to talk about how we pay down that debt or any spending reforms. Now, we all know the fact that at $31.5 trillion, $31.7 trillion, we're on an unsustainable path. Everybody knows that. And the debt ceiling is important because it forces us to do something we should do anyway, and that is have a serious conversation about our nation's spending habits, about Congress's spending habits. Well, President Biden announced this debt ceiling crisis that was looming and subject only to how much money was coming in the door in terms of tax revenue as to when the X date would hit. Now we hear from the Secretary of the Treasury it's probably sometime in June. But instead of engaging back when the announcement was made, the president stuck his fingers in his ears and refused to even discuss any sort of negotiated outcome. Again, this is the party that spent more than $2.6 trillion by themselves. And now they're refusing to entertain any ideas or any suggestion that, yes, America has a spending problem. But we know it does. We know we do. And we know Congress and the president are the only ones who can deal with it. Well, to make matters worse, Democrats in Congress, including the president, have even attacked Republicans for trying to act responsibly to deal with this debt ceiling and to have the temerity to suggest that, yes, there are some spending reforms that need to be coupled along with it. Earlier this year, the Senate Majority Leader criticized House Republicans' approach to the debt ceiling as hostage-taking. He described it as dangerous and destabilizing. But he failed to mention this was the exact same approach he took several years ago. You know, that's one thing I've learned about the Senate. If you're around here long enough, and if you're not careful, you're liable to find yourself on both sides of an issue and look a little hypocritical in the process. So back in 2017, our country was in a similar position. The United States hit the debt ceiling. The Treasury Department began using extraordinary measures to continue to pay the bills. And Congress was racing the clock to avoid a default. At that point, Republicans held the majority in the Senate, and Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said the debt ceiling gave Democrats leverage in bipartisan talks. He and then Speaker Nancy Pelosi strategically used a potential debt crisis to strengthen their hand in broader negotiations, which is a pretty sharp contrast with Senator Schumer's position today. When he was the one trying to negotiate, the debt ceiling was fair game as leverage. But when it's House Republicans who are being the responsible ones by initiating a proposal to raise the debt ceiling, and I say initiating a negotiation, hopefully. He says it's dangerous, it's destabilizing, it's hostage-taking. The hypocrisy is palpable. The problem with Democrats' argument isn't just rhetorical, it's also impractical. From the get-go, Speaker McCarthy has made it absolutely clear that a clean debt ceiling increase will not pass the House. The votes aren't there, plain and simple. Now Senate Republicans have made it abundantly clear that a clean debt ceiling cannot pass the Senate. Those are the facts. It won't pass the House, and it can't pass the Senate. Last week, I joined 42 Republican colleagues in affirming our support for the House's proposal to initiate a negotiation to raise the debt ceiling. We signed a letter to Senator Schumer that was led by my friend Senator Lee of Utah, saying we will not vote for cloture on any bill that raises the debt ceiling without substantive spending and budget reforms. We all know that in a chamber that requires 60 votes to move legislation, a united bloc of 43 senators means that it ain't going to happen. If Senator Schumer puts a clean debt ceiling increase on the floor, it will fail. He won't have the votes. And that's just a fact of life. So the big question now is, where does that leave us? I see two options. Option one, the Senate can spend the next few weeks holding show votes on bills that are guaranteed to fail. Democrats can waste even more time as our country inches closer and closer to a debt crisis, something both sides have said they want to avoid. Or, second option, the president can get off the sidelines and start negotiating with Speaker McCarthy so we can make progress on a bipartisan bill that will actually pass both chambers of Congress. I think we know what's going to happen. There has to be a negotiated outcome. The president can say, I'm not going to negotiate. He will negotiate if he wants to avoid economic catastrophe. Already the public is very anxious about the condition of our economy. Inflation's at a 40-year high. It's come down a tad, but the Federal Reserve continues to raise interest rates, making everything more expensive. Companies are laying off employees, particularly in the tech sector. People are worried. Their cost of living has increased dramatically. I was having lunch with a friend of mine in Austin, Texas yesterday, who's a home builder, and he talked about the dramatic increase in the components of the homes that he builds, everything from lumber to air conditioning to plumbing, you name it. Everything is more expensive. So President Biden will, contrary to his current position, he will negotiate. I am confident of that. But it seems like he is committed to a soap opera in the meantime, a lot of drama, a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth, a lot of speculation that's going to do nothing but to rattle the confidence of the American people in their economy and what the future may hold. This is really an unforced error by the president. It's time to accept the fact that a clean debt ceiling increase has no chance of becoming law. So the ball is in our Democratic colleagues' court. I think President Biden didn't think Speaker McCarthy would be able to pull together the votes to pass a bill in the House. And he thought, that gives me ultimate leverage. Because the Republicans in the House can't get it together, they're going to have no option but to deal with me on my terms. But Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans, I'm proud to say, were able to come up with a reasonable bill that includes raising the debt ceiling. Now, I understand President Biden may say, well, I don't like that. There's parts of it I simply can't accept, but that's how negotiations get started, but not if the President of the United States, the leader of the free world, is sitting on his couch waiting for the American people to become more and more anxious about their future, including the future of the economy and their jobs. Last month, the House passed a bill to avert a debt crisis, and now it's the Democrats' turn to respond. That's negotiating 101. One side makes an offer, and the other side counteroffers. Each day, our country is moving closer and closer to a debt default. President Biden has wasted months parroting the same ridiculous talking points. And now is not the time to double down on that tired rhetoric. It's time to start talking. And again, it's not uncommon for debt limit increases to be coupled with broader negotiations. As I pointed out, Senator Schumer was a proponent of that back in 2017. He said at the time that the debt ceiling, quote, gives another ample opportunity for bipartisanship, not for one party jamming its choices down the throats of the other, close quote. I agree with Senator Schumer in 2017, and I disagree with Chuck Schumer in 2023 in his current position. So far, Democrats have blindly adhered to this position of no negotiations, no reforms. Let's just keep on spending until we bankrupt this country. It's time to change course and to focus on solutions. The art of the possible, that's what we're here to do. We need to focus on solutions that can pass a Republican-led House and a Democrat-led Senate. And that means Speaker McCarthy and President Biden need to talk. And more than that, they need to reach an agreement, and to do so soon. It's time for President Biden to respond to the House's offer with the reasonable counteroffer and to negotiate an end to this potential debt ceiling crisis. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.